Chapter 7. Jake Spoon stood in the door of the low house watching Call and Dietz head for the barn. He'd been looking forward to being home for the moment he looked out the door of the saloon and saw the dead man laying in the mud across the wide main street of Fort Smith. But now that he was home, it came back to him how nervous things could be if Call wasn't in his best mood. "Dietz' pants are a sight, ain't they?" he said mildly. "Seems to me he used to dress better." Augustus chuckled. "He used to dress worse," he said. "Why, he had that sheepskin coat for 15 years. You couldn't get in 5 feet of him without the lice jumping on you. It was because of that coat we made him sleep in the barn. I ain't finicky except when it comes to lice." "What happened to it?" Jake asked. "I burned it," Augustus said. "Done it one summer when Dietz was off on a trip with Call. I told him buffalo hunter stole it. Dietz was ready to track him and get his coat back, but I talked him out of it." "Well, it was his coat," Jake said. "I don't blame him." "Hell, Dietz didn't need it," Augustus said. "It ain't cold down here. Dietz was just attached to it because he had it so long. You remember when we found it, don't you? You was along." "I may have been along, but I don't remember," Jake said, lighting a smoke. "We found that coat in an abandoned cabin up on the Brazos," Augustus said. "I guess the settlers that run out decided it was too heavy to carry. It weighed as much as a good-sized sheep, which is why Call gave it to Dietz. He was the only one of us stout enough to carry it all day. Don't you remember that, Jake? It was the time we had that scrap up there on Fort Phantom Hill." "I remember a scrape, but the rest is kind of cloudy," Jake said. "I guess all you boys have got to do is sit around and talk about the old times. I'm young yet, Gus. I got a living to make." In fact, what he did remember was being scared every time they crossed the Brazos, since it would just be 10 or 12 of them and no reason not to think they would run into 100 Comanches or Kiowas. He would have been glad to quit rangering if he could have thought of a way to do it that wouldn't look bad, but there was no way. In the end, he came through 12 Indian fights and many scrapes with bandits, only to get in trouble in Fort Smith, Arkansas, on the safest town as you could find. Now that he'd come back, it was just to be reminded of Maggie, who had always threatened to die if he ever left her. Of course, he had thought it just girlish talk, the kind of thing all women said when they were trying to hold a fella. Jake had heard such talk all the way up the trail, in San Antonio and Fort Worth, Abilene and Dodge, in Ogalla and Miles City, the talk of horse pretending to be in love, for one. But Maggie had actually died, when he had only supposed she would just move on to another town. It was a sad memory to come home to, though for him, what he knew of the situation, Call had done her even worse than he had. "Jake, I noticed you've not answered me about Clara," Augustus said. "If you've been to see her, I'd like to hear about it, even though I begrudge you every minute." "Oh, you ain't got much begrudging to do," Jake said. "I just seen her for a minute outside a store in Ogalla. That darn Bob was with her, so all I could do was tip my hat and say good morning." "I swear, Jake, I thought you'd have more gumption than that," Augustus said. "They live up in Nebraska, do they?" "Yes, on the North Platte," Jake said. "Why, he's the biggest horse trader in the territory. The Army gets most of its horses from him, what Army's left in them parts. And the Army wears out a lot of horses. I reckon he's close to rich." "Any young'uns?" Augustus asked. "2 girls, I believe," Jake said. "I heard her boys died. Bob wasn't too friendly. I wasn't asked to supper." "Even old dumb Bob's got enough sense to keep the likes of you away from Clara," Augustus said. "How'd she look?" "Clara?" Jake said. "Not as pretty as she once was." "I guess it's a hard life up in Nebraska," Gus said. After that, neither of them had any more to say for a few minutes. Jake thought it ill-spoken of Gus to bring up Clara, a woman he no longer had any sympathy for since she had shown him the door and even married a big dumb horse trader from Kentucky. Even losing her to Gus wouldn't have been so bitter a blow, since Gus had been her beau before he met her. Augustus felt his own pangs, irked mainly that Jake had had a glimpse of Clara, whereas he himself had to make do with an occasional scrap of gossip. At 16, she had been so pretty it took your breath, and smart, too. A girl with some sand, as she had quickly shown when both her parents had been killed in the big Indian raid of '56, the worst ever to take rake that part of the country. Clara had been in school in San Antonio when it happened, but she came right back to Austin and ran the store her parents had started. The Indians had tried to set fire to it, but for some reason it didn't catch. Augustus felt he might have won her that year, but as luck would have it, he was married then to his second wife, and by the time she died, Clara had developed such an independent mind that winning her was no longer an easy thing. In fact, it proved an impossible thing. She wouldn't have him or Jake either, and yet she married Bob Allen, a man so dumb he could hardly walk through a door without bumping his head. They soon went north. Since then, Augustus had kept his ear open for news that she was widowed. He didn't wish Clara any unpleasantness, but horse trading in Indian country was risky business. If Bob should meet an untimely end, as better men had, he wanted to be the first to offer assistance to the widow. "That Bob Allen's lucky," he remarked. "I've known horse traders who didn't last a year." "Why, hell, you're a horse trader yourself," Jake said. "You boys have let yourselves get stuck. You should have gone north long ago. There's plenty of opportunity left up north." "That may be, Jake, but all you've done with it is kill a dentist," Augustus said. "At least we ain't committed no ridiculous crimes." Jake smiled. "Have you got anything to drink around here?" he asked, "or do you sit around all day with your throat parched?" "He gets drunk," Bolivar said, waking up suddenly. Augustus stood up. "Let's go for a stroll," he said. "This man don't like folks idling in his kitchen after a certain hour." They walked out into the hot morning. The sky was already white. Bolivar followed them out, picking up a rawhide lariat that had been kept on a pile of firewood back by the porch. They watched him walk off into the chaparral, the rope in his hand. "That old pistolero ain't very polite," Jake said. "Where's he going with that rope?" "I didn't ask him," Gus said. He went around to the spring house, which was empty of rattlesnakes for once. It amused him to think how annoyed Call would be when he came up at noon and found them both drunk. He handed Jake the jug since he was the guest. Jake uncorked it and took a modest swig. "Now, if we had some shade to drink this in, we'd be in good shape," Jake said. "I don't suppose there's a sporting woman in this town, is there?" "You are a scamp," Augustus said, taking the jug. "Are you so rich that's all you can think about?" "I can think about it, rich or poor," Jake said. They squatted in the shade of the spring house for a bit, their backs against the adobe, which was still cool on the side the sun hadn't struck. Augustus saw no need to mention Lorena, since he knew Jake would soon discover her for himself, and probably have her in love with him within the week. The thought of Dish Boggett's bad timing made him smile, for it was certain Jake's return would doom whatever chance Dish might have had. Dish had committed himself to a day of well digging for nothing, for when it came to getting women in love with him, Jake Spoon had no equal. His big eyes convinced them he'd be lost without them, and none of them seemed to want him just to go out and be lost. While they were squatting by the spring house, the pigs came nosing around the house looking for something to eat, but there wasn't so much as a grasshopper in the yard. They stopped and looked at Augustus just for a minute. "Get on down to the saloon," he said. "Maybe you'll find Lippy's hat." "Folks that keep pigs ain't no better than farmers," Jake said. "I'm surprised at you and Call. If you gave up being lawman, I thought you'd at least stay cattleman." "I thought you'd own a railroad by now, for that matter," Augustus said, "or a whorehouse at least. I guess life's been a disappointment to us both." "I may not have no fortune, but I've never said a word to a pig either," Jake said. Now that he was home back with friends, he was beginning to feel sleepy. After a few more swigs, a little more argument, he stretched out as close to the spring house as he could so as to have shade for as long as possible. He raised an elbow to have one more go at the jug. "How come Call lets you sit around and guzzle this mash all day?" he asked. "Call ain't never been my boss," Augustus said. "It's no say-so of his when I drink." Jake looked off across the scrubby pastures. There were tufts of grass here and there, but mostly the ground looked hard as flint. Heat waves were rising off it like fumes of kerosene. Something moved in his line of vision, and for a moment he thought he saw some strange brown animal under a chaparral bush. Looking more closely, he saw that it was the old Mexican's bare backside. "Hell, why'd he take a rope if all he meant to do was shit?" he asked. "Where'd you get the greasy old bastard?" "We're running a charitable home for retired criminals," Augustus said. "If you'd just retire, you'd qualify." "Darn, I forgot how ugly this country is," Jake said. "I guess if there was a market for snake meat, this would be a place to get rich." With that, he put his hat over his face, and within nothing more than 2 minutes began a gentle snoring. Augustus returned the jug to the spring house. It occurred to him that while Jake was napping, he might pay a visit to Lori. Once she fell under Jake's spell, he would probably require her to suspend professional activities for a while. Augustus viewed this prospect philosophically. It was his experience that a man's dealing with women were invariably prone to interruptions, often of more lasting nature than Jake Spoon was apt to prompt. He left Jake sleeping and strolled down the middle of Hat Creek. As he passed the corrals, he saw a dish straining at the windlass to bring a big bucket of dirt out of the new well. Call was in the lot working with the hell bitch. He had her snubbed to a post and was fanning her with a saddle blanket. Dish was wet with sweat, as if he'd just crawled out of a horse trough. He'd sweated through the hatband of his hat and had even sweated through his belt. "Dish, you're plumb wet," Augustus said. "If there was a well there, I'd figure you fell in it." "If folks could drink sweat, you wouldn't need no well," Dish said. It seemed to Augustus that his tone was a shade unfriendly. "Look at it this way, Dish," Augustus said. "You're storing up manna in heaven, working like this." "Heaven be damned," Dish said. Augustus smiled. "Why, the Bible just asks for the sweat of your brow," he said. "You're even sweating from the belt buckle, Dish. That ought to put you in good shape with Seraphim." The reference was lost on Dish, who bitterly regretted his foolishness in allowing himself to be drawn into such undignified work. Augustus stood there grinning at him as if the sight of a man sweating was the most amusing thing in the world. "I'd have kicked you down this hole," Dish said. "If you hadn't loaned me that money, I'd be halfway to Matagorda by now." Augustus walked over to the fence to watch Call work the mare. He was about to throw the saddle on her. He had snubbed her close, but she still had her eye turned so she could watch him in the case he got careless. "You ought to blindfold her," Augustus said. "I thought you'd know that much." "I don't want her blindfolded," Cal said. "If she was blindfolded, she might bite the post next time instead of you," Augustus said. Call got her to accept the blanket and picked up his saddle. Snubbed as she was, she couldn't bite him, but her hind legs weren't snubbed. He kept close to her shoulder as he prepared to ease on the saddle. The mare let go with near hind foot. It didn't get him, but it got the saddle and nearly knocked it out of his hand. He kept close to her shoulder and got the saddle in position again. "Remember that horse that bit off the old boy's toes, all the ones on the left foot, I mean?" Augustus said. "The old boy's name was Harwell. He went to the war and got killed at Vicksburg. He never was much of a hand after he lost his toes. Of course, the horse that bit him off had a head the size of a pumpkin. I don't suppose a little mare like that could take off 5 toes in one bite." Call eased the saddle on her. In the minute the stirrup slapped against her belly, the mare went as high as she could, and the saddle flew off and landed 20 feet away. Augustus got a big laugh out of it. Call went to the barn and returned with a short rawhide rope. "If you want help, just ask me," Augustus said. "I don't," Call said. "Not from you." "Call, you ain't never learned," Augustus said. "There's plenty of gentle horses in this world. Why would a man with your responsibilities want to waste time with a filly that's got to be hobbled and blindfolded before you can keep a saddle on her?" Call ignored him. In a moment, the mare tentatively lifted the near hind foot, and with the thought of kicking whatever might be in range. When she did, he caught the foot with the rawhide rope and took a hitch around the snubbing post. It left the mare standing on 3 legs, so she could not kick again without throwing herself. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, trembling a little with indignation, but she accepted the saddle. "Why don't you trade her to Jake?" Augustus said. "If they don't hang him, maybe he could teach her to pace." Call left the mare saddled, snubbed, and on 3 legs and came to the fence to have a smoke, let the mare have a moment to consider the situation. "Where's Jake?" he asked. "Catching a nap," Augustus said. "I reckon the anxiety wore him out." "He ain't changed a bit," Call said. "Not a darn bit." Augustus laughed. "You're one to talk," he said. "When's the last time you changed? It must have been before we met, and that was 30 years ago." "Look at her watches," Call said. The mare was watching them, even had her ears pointed at them. "I wouldn't take it as no compliment," Augustus said. "She ain't watching you because she loves you." "Say what you will," Call said. "I've never seen a more intelligent filly." Augustus laughed again. "Oh, that's what you look for, is it? Intelligence," he said. "You and me's got the opposite idea about things. It's intelligent creatures you got to watch out for. I don't care if they're horses or women or Indians or what. I learned long ago there's much to be said for dumbness. A dumb horse may step in a hole once in a while, but at least you can turn your back on one without losing a patch of hide." "I'd rather my horses didn't step in no holes," Call said. You reckon somebody's really on Jake's trail? Hard to judge, Augustus said. Jake was always nervous. He's seen more Indians that turned out to be sagebrushes than any man I know. Dead dentist ain't a sagebrush, Call said. No. In that case, it's the sheriff that's the unknown factor, Gus said. Maybe he didn't like his brother. Maybe some outlaw will shoot him before he can come after Jake. Maybe he'll get lost and end up in Washington, D.C. Or maybe he'll show up tomorrow and whip us all. I wouldn't lay money. They fell silent for a moment. The only sound, the grinding of the windlass as Dish drew up another bucket of dirt. Why not go north, Call said, taking Augustus by surprise. I don't know, Augustus said. I've never given the matter no thought, and so far as I know, you haven't either. I do think we're a shade old to do much Indian fighting. There won't be much, Call said. You heard Jake. It's the same up there as it is down here. The Indians will soon be whipped. And Jake does know good country when he sees it. It sounds like a cattleman's paradise. No, it sounds like a goddamn wilderness, Augustus said. Why, there ain't even a house to go to. I've slept on the ground enough for one life. Now I'm in the mood for a little civilization. I don't have to have operas and streetcars, but I do enjoy a decent bed and a roof to keep out of the weather. He said there were fortunes to be made, Call said. Stands to reason he's right. Somebody's going to settle it up and get that land. Suppose we got there first. We could buy you 40 beds. The surprising thing to Augustus was not just what Call was suggesting, but how he sounded. For years, Call had looked at life as if it were essentially over. Call had never been a man who could think of much reason for acting happy, but then he'd always been one who knew his purpose. His purpose was to get done what needed to be done, and what needed to be done was simple, if not easy. The settlers of Texas needed protection from the Indians on the north and bandits on the south. As a ranger, Call had a job that fit him, and he had gone about the work with vigor that would have passed for happiness in another man. But the job wore out. In the South, it became mainly a matter of protecting the cattle herds of rich men like Captain King or Shanghai Pierce, both of whom had more cattle than any one man needed. In the North, the Army had finally taken the fight against the Comanches away from the Rangers and had nearly finished it. He and Call had no military rank or standing, weren't welcomed by the Army. With forts all across the northwestern frontier, the free roving Rangers found that they were always interfering with the Army, or else being interfered with. When the Civil War came, the governor himself called them in and asked them not to go. With so many men gone, they needed at least one reliable troop of Rangers to keep the peace on the border. It was that assignment that brought them to Lonesome Dove. After the war, the cattle market came into existence, and all the big landowners in South Texas began to make up herds and trail them north to the Kansas railheads. Once cattle became the game and the brush country filled up with cowboys and cattle traders, he and Call finally stopped rangering. It was no trouble for them to cross the river and bring back a few hundred head at a time to sell to the traders who were happy and too lazy to go into Mexico themselves. They prospered in a small way. There was enough money in their account in San Antonio that they could have considered themselves rich had that notion interested them, but it didn't. Augustus knew that nothing about the life they were living interested Call particularly. They had enough money that they could have bought land, but they hadn't, although plenty of land could still be had wonderfully cheap. It was that they had roved too long. Augustus concluded, when his mind turned to such matters, they were people of the horse, not of the town, in that they were more like the Comanches than Call would ever have admitted. They had been in Lonesome Dove nearly 10 years, and yet what little property they had acquired was so worthless that neither of them would have felt bad about just saddling up and riding off from it. Indeed, it seemed to Augustus that this was what both of them had always expected would happen. They were not of a settled fraternity, he and Call. From the time to time they talked about going west of the Pecos, perhaps rangering out there, but so far only the rare settler who cared to challenge the Apache, so there was no need for rangers. Augustus had not expected that Call would be satisfied just to rustle Mexican cattle forever, but neither had he expected him to suddenly decide to strike out for Montana. Yet it was obvious the idea had taken hold of the man. "I'll tell you what, Call," Augustus said. "You and Dietz and P go on up there to Montany and build a nice snug cabin with a good fireplace and at least one bed so it'll be waiting when I get there. Then clear out the last of the Cheyenne and the Blackfeet and any Sioux that look rambunctious. When you done that, me and Jake and Newt will gather up a herd and meet you on the Powder River." Call looked almost amused. "I'd like to see the herd you and Jake could get there with," he said. "Herd of whores, maybe." "I'm sure it would be a blessing if we could herd a few up that way," Augustus said. "I don't suppose there's a decent woman in the whole territory yet." Then the thought struck him that there could be no getting to Montana without crossing the Platte, and Clara lived on the Platte. Bob Allen or no, she would ask him to supper, and if only to show off her girls. Jake's news might be out of date. Maybe she'd even run her husband off since Jake had passed through. Anyway, husbands had been got around for a few times in the history of the world, if only to the extent of having a set place for an old rival at a supper table. Such thoughts put the whole prospect in a more attractive light. "How far do you reckon it is to Montany, Call?" he asked. Call looked north across the dusty flats as if estimating in his mind's eye the great rise of the plains stretching even farther than hearsay, away and beyond the talk of men. Jake that morning had mentioned the Milk River, a stream that he had never heard of. He knew the country he knew and had never been lost in it, but the country he knew stopped at the Arkansas River. He had known men speak of the Yellowstone as if it were the boundary of the world. Even Kit Carson, who he'd met twice, had not talked of what lay north of it. But then his memory went back to a camp they had made on the Brazos many years ago with an army captain. There was a Delaware scout with him who had been farther than any man they knew, all the way to the headwaters of the Missouri. "Remember Black Beaver, Gus?" he asked. He'd know how far it was. "I remember him," Augustus said. "It was always a puzzle to me how such a short-legged Indian covers so much ground." "He claimed to have been all the way from the Columbia to the Rio Grande," Call said. "That's knowing the country, I'd say." "Well, he was an Indian," Augustus said. "He didn't have to go along establishing law and order and making it safe for bankers and Sunday school teachers like we done. I guess that's why you're ready to head off to Montany. You want to help establish a few more banks." "That's aggravating," Call said. "I ain't a banker." "No, you've done many a banker a good turn," Augustus said. "That's what we done, you know. Killed the darn Indians so they wouldn't bother the bankers." "They bothered more than the bankers," Call said. "Yes, lawyers and doctors and newspaper men and drummers of every description," Augustus said. "Not to mention women and children," Call said. "Not to mention plain settlers." "Why, women and children and settlers are just cannon fodder for lawyers and bankers," Augustus said. "After the Indians wipe out enough of them, you get your public outcry, and we go choose the Indians out of the way. If they keep coming back, then the army takes over and chooses them worse. Finally, the army will manage to whip them down to where they can be squeezed onto some reservation so the lawyers and the bankers can come in and get civilization started. Every bank in Texas ought to pay us a commission for the work we done. If we hadn't done it, all the bankers would still be back in Georgia, living on poke salad and turnip greens." "I don't know why you stuck with it if that's the way you think," Call said. "Should have gone home and taught school." "Hell no," Augustus said. "I wanted to look at it before the bankers and lawyers get it." "Well, they ain't got to Montana," Call said. "If we go, they won't be far behind," Augustus said. "The first ones that get there will hire you to go hang all the horse thieves and bring in whichever Indians got the most fight left, and you'll do it, and the place will be civilized. Then you won't know what to do with yourself no more than you have these last 10 years. "I ain't a boy," Call said. "I'll be dead before all that happens. Anyhow, I ain't going there to law. I'm going there to run cattle. Jake said it was a cattleman's paradise." "You ain't no cattleman, Call," Augustus said. "No more than I am. If we was to get a ranch, I don't know who'd run it." It seemed to Call the mare had probably stood on 3 legs long enough, and he had surely jawed with Gus long enough. Sometimes Gus sang a strange tune. He had killed as many Indians as any ranger, and he'd seen enough of their butchery that you'd think he knew why he was doing it, and yet when he talked, he seemed to be on their side. "As to the ranch," he said, "the boy could run it. He's nearly grown." Augustus puzzled over that for a moment, as if it had never occurred to him. "Well, maybe so, Call," he said. "I guess he could run it if he was a mind to, and if you'd let him." "I don't know why he wouldn't be a mind to," Call said, and walked over to the mare.